when you're thinking about learning something, if you want to get more familiar with something, there's a big power in this grazing idea, in this interweaving. Is that what it was called?
Interleaving, like you're leaving. Yeah.
Leaving. I love this idea because it basically says that you're going to dedicate yourself to learning or experiencing something and you want to make it surround sound. That's what I would call it. It's like surround sound learning. It's like you should
Right.
be listening to that music, doing a cooking class, learning it on your computer, learning it on your iPad, learning it on your podcast when you're cooking dishes. I think that all of those things can create an experience where it's actually changing your brain because you're putting in so many inputs. Does that sound right?
Well, absolutely. And don't forget that learning means changing your brain. If you're learning something, you're creating new neural connections in the brain, you're changing your brain.
Who are the world's most interesting people? And what fascinating, groundbreaking, incredible things can they teach us? In this new series, I leave our Science of People lab to interview my favorite authors, experts, and celebrities for them to share their best people hacks, social skills, and stories. And let me tell you, they have some juicy tips. This is a new series I'm calling The World's Most Interesting People. Hello, YouTube friends. Today, we're going to get you learning something new, hopefully a new language, because today I have Steve Kaufmann on our YouTube channel. I want to give you a quick bio before he says hello. Steve Kaufmann speaks 20 languages. He's a former Canadian diplomat and the co-founder of Linguist.com. He's also the author of The Linguist, a personal guide to language learning. It's amazing, and this is my favorite part of your story, is because until the age of 17, Steve spoke only English, but has taught himself 19 languages pretty fluently and is sharing his system. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
nice to be here.
I said to Steve, I was like, don't share anything good, because I am constantly, if you watch a lot of these YouTube videos, you know, I am always recommending that people learn languages or learn something new, because if we're fighting boring, right, if we don't want to be boring, the best thing you can do is learn something new. And Steve, I mentioned this to you and you said something interesting about learning. You want to share it again?
Well, you said that it makes you more interesting. I say it makes you more interesting to yourself. And you know what I mean by that is, so right now I'm learning Persian and Arabic, right? So as a result of learning Persian, I read up on the history of Iran, which connects me to Central Asia. And 1,000 years ago in Bukhara, they were much more advanced than Europe was in terms of astronomy. And I never knew that. Then I go to a local Persian grocery store and I find that they have a sour prune that's very similar to the Japanese sour plum. Like there's so many more. That's just a very small example, right? And I can go into all of my languages. And all of these things make your everyday existence more interesting, not to speak of when you travel.
Okay, so this is something I think that what's really crucial is you should be leading an interesting life. Not only for others, yes, that's wonderful, for the people in your life, your partner, meeting your soulmate, your colleagues, meeting people at parties, but also for yourself, going on interesting quests. And that's a great one. Like you just went on a quest to a Persian grocery store because it was sparked by this interest in language, right? Like I'm guessing you've never been to one before, or you went out somewhere?
Well, let's put it this way. I felt more comfortable. First of all, I want to go there so I can practice if you throw, impress them with my Farsi, with my Persian, right? The Persians are particularly appreciative if you speak their language. Okay. I'll give you another example.
Yes.
I was taking some old clothes to a thrift store here because we're doing a renovation. So you're, of course, getting rid of junk. And the lady there was, again, an Iranian immigrant. So I spoke to her in Persian. And she was so pleased. And she said to me, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you, she says. And you know
so
what?
Beautiful.
And I tweeted out, then I drove home. And on our website, I have this person in Iran who creates content for us. She records stuff in Persian, and then she creates the transcript. And she's done one on famous Iranians and history and stuff. And I was listening to her description of Omar Khayyam. A lot of people don't know that, they've heard of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, but he was an astronomer, a philosopher, a mathematician. And I'm listening to all of this in Persian in my car. So she may have been proud of me. I was proud of myself.
Yes. Yes. So most people don't know this about me, but I speak Spanish. I started learning Spanish at a very young age, and then I moved on to French, which was actually the most challenging language I thought that I've ever tried my hand at. And then in
Mhm.
college, I actually learned Mandarin, and I lived in China, which most of my followers don't know.
Wow,
And I found that French was actually harder than Mandarin and way harder than Spanish.
really, really.
Very, very much. But one thing that you mentioned that really resonates with me is I noticed that when I began to learn Mandarin, and as I began to travel in China and really try to use my Chinese every day, I noticed that I often had to say something 3 times, even when it was perfect Mandarin when I was in China. And the reason for it was because the first time people were so shocked that I was speaking Mandarin that they were just taking in the fact that I was speaking it. They weren't even trying to understand. The second time, they were so pleased that I was speaking Mandarin that they were enjoying the process of it. And the third time, they were actually trying to understand.
Yeah,
And
sounds familiar.
yes, and so I think that there's a certain kind of pride that comes from all kinds of learning. And so a lot of our people watching, maybe they're like me. I'm a recovering awkward person, Steve, if you didn't know, and I have to work on my social anxiety. And I think a lot of people watching do as well. Learning is one of the fastest ways to build confidence. Have you found that as you get better and better at a language, you feel just more confident as a person?
It's very interesting. Yes, obviously, the more comfortable you are, the more you think that you have skills and powers and so forth, the better you feel about yourself. The other interesting thing is that when you are learning a foreign language, to some degree, or even when you're speaking a foreign language, it's make believe because reality is your own language, right? So
Mm.
even if you are a little shy or awkward in your own language, when you're in that other language, you're now in make believe. And so I think a lot of people who might be sort of introverted in their own language, when they're going through this charade, this play acting of speaking in another language, they're able to be less. Now, that's not all. Some people are very self conscious about themselves when they speak in a foreign language. But I have noticed that the other is also true that people enjoy this sort of play acting, getting out of the reality of their native language. And sometimes they have a different personality, a more outgoing personality.
Okay, yes, I have noticed this as well. I also think I'm a persistent overthinker. I
Mm-hmm.
over worry, I overthink. Well, in new language, whenever I was learning new language, and still when I learn new language, I find that I have less words, right? I literally cannot overthink in the new language because I only have so many words. And so I find that it actually simplifies worry and overthinking.
Yes.
Have you ever experienced that?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I'm an overthinker, but as I say, when you are speaking in a foreign language or learning, and I should say too that my major activity when I'm learning a foreign language is listening and reading.
Mm.
Okay, I don't begin by trying to speak. I have no words. I don't understand. So it's in a way it is a solitary activity. You know, the time that you spend trying to use the 15 words that you know in the language, you're not learning very much.
Mm.
If you can instead spend that time listening and reading and acquiring words and phrases, you're actually getting more of the language into your brain because the brain will eventually start to get used to the language. So that's one of the things that I think is very important for people to realize. The brain will learn. Like if you feed the brain enough stimulus, the brain will learn. The brain, it's made to learn. That's the brain. That it's a pattern forming machine, and every bit of stimulus and experience, it starts to form little patterns. So it is a solitary activity. Again, sometimes people say, "Oh, you have to be extroverted to be a good language learner because you have to be outgoing and stuff like that." And I don't find that to be true at all, because to be effective, to learn a language, you need words. Okay. Unfortunately, the words you're not going to acquire them by going at random people in the street and hoping to say a few things, because you're going to use the same lines over and over again. You're never
Right,
going to expand your vocabulary.
right.
So actually, if you are interested in things, and this is where it all comes back to interest. If you have interests, if you are motivated, and you can stay home and listen and read, or in your car, or I listen while doing the dishes, I listen while working out. I listen, I don't fully understand, then I go and read the same content on our website where I can look up words, where I can create flashcards. There's a whole bunch of stuff there that helps me. And so that's the bulk of I don't talk my way to fluency. I build myself up to a level where now I can engage in meaningful conversations, where we're not saying, "Hi, where do you live? What's the weather like? How old are you?" That's fine. you know. So this business of introvert extrovert is irrelevant. The question is who can quickly build up their comprehension and their vocabulary level to a point where they can carry on meaningful conversations. And I think introverted people are just as interested in meaningful conversations as extroverted people, maybe more so. So it's not an issue of introvert or extrovert.
Okay, first of all, that's such a relief, right? That's such a relief that component can actually be removed from the most critical part of learning. I also
Mhm.
wanted to ask you, do you believe in learning styles? Like I often hear people say, "Oh, well, I'm an auditory learner, so I have to listen to things." Or I hear people say, "I'm a verbalizer. I have to verbalize and talk and talk and talk and out." Or I hear, "I'm a critical thinker. I have to write it out myself." Do you believe in that?
100% no.
Okay, tell me why. Tell me.
Because I've done a fair amount of reading about how the brain learns, and all of our brains are similar in how they learn. In other words, what happens is there's a lot of stimulus. The brain, by the way, forgets things right away. So the brain is very poor at remembering details. If you study a word list, you're going to forget it. There's no way you're going to remember. If you look something up in the dictionary, you're going to forget it immediately. So the brain starts to form these patterns. And that's the same in all of us. But we also have preferences. Some people like watching movies. Some people like listening to music. But the way the brain learns is the same. But obviously, if you don't like reading. There are people who don't like to read.
Right.
Reading is very, very good for you for language learning, for everybody.
Yes.
But if you don't like reading, well, you're not going to read. So it's important to do things that we like to do. But there is no proof. In fact, it's been debunked regularly. There's all kinds of, you know, pedagogical experts who have said this is, but unfortunately, the teaching profession is very prone to fads. And of course, then you get people who sell these fads, they promote them, and they have seminars. And once a teacher's been to a seminar where they taught her or him about learning styles, and that's it, you know, that's my thing now. I can't drop it because I invested so much money to go to a seminar. But all the research indicates that there is no such thing. There are personal preferences, but all of our brains are constructed the same way in the way we convert experience into patterns, patterns that enable us to deal with life that comes at us. That's true of learning languages. It's true of all kinds of other things. No learning style. No.
Well, thank you for debunking that myth because I agree with you. I think that there's preference, but actually when it comes down to it, the way that we get something into long-term memory storage is the same. I
Yes.
wanted to ask you
100%.
if so you learn languages, if you feel that the system that you've created for learning languages is the same for learning anything, learning to make sushi, learning to ride a bike, is it the same or does learning change based on the activity?
See, I don't know the answer to that. I think that our system would be very effective for improving literacy, for example. I'd be very interested in doing that because poor literacy costs individuals and society a fortune,
Oh,
a fortune. In fact, the best measure of how successful people will be in life is their literacy level.
wow.
Not even years of schooling, because people go to college and they're still very illiterate. I mean, they have sort of functional illiteracy, illiteracy problems. So I think it would work for that because it's a combination of sound and some learning of words and phrases, and then seeing them again in context and reminding you, and it's a whole bunch of stuff there that works. Okay, would it work for learning other things? Those things that I think are common are the following. To learn anything, you cannot focus in and just learn it. Like if you're studying history at college and you're just going to read this one book and you're going to memorize the book and you're going to learn everything in that book, that's not very effective.
Right.
It's far better for you to read 5 books on the same subject. There's a professor at UCLA who talks about interleaving. In other words, don't just learn one thing, learn something over here, graze over somewhere else, come back to it, give your brain a rest and stuff. So this kind of wandering learning the same thing from different perspectives, covering the same ground in different formats, all of this I think is true. Okay.
Okay, yes, keep going.
And the other thing too is in language learning, I sometimes say, like, all of the grammar explanations are useless until you have had experience with the language.
Right.
So you have to begin by gaining that experience. Then the grammar can confirm things that you have already experienced. And I think many things that we learn are like that. We almost first have to get used to them, almost have to know them before we can learn them. So that the formal learning confirms things that you have already experienced. So that, to me, is the most effective way of learning, certainly for languages, where I think what they do in schools, where they try to teach you the grammar up front. They try to explain to you how this language works, and yet your brain has not yet had an opportunity to form any patterns around that language. If, on the other hand, they let you, and this is easily done, like a link, you read, you listen, you look up words. So if you do it that way, so you build up that experience, then now you're curious. So when you're curious, you can look up grammar rules, or even if grammar rules are taught to you, they then describe something that you already have a sense for. But unfortunately, in schools, they try to teach you the grammar up front, and then they test you on it. And testing you on it just increases your level of anxiety. And so it's all very damaging.
What you're saying is interesting to me because it reminds me of, it might explain actually why I struggled so much with French. So I learned French exactly as you're explaining. Grammar rules in my desk, in school, textbook class, that's all it was. And I found it incredibly challenging. Versus Mandarin, I learned in college. And Mandarin was amazing because accidentally I started reading fiction books about Chinese history, right? Just fiction books. And then I was in a Chinese history class, and I was in my Chinese language class. And then I took a Chinese cooking class. And then I learned where the Asian market was nearby. And I began to just walk up and down the aisles. And then I saw that there was Chinese gallery exhibitions where I could go see Chinese art. And so I was like, wow, I am picking up this language so fast and everything is making sense to me. And I think that maybe that's why. And for anyone who's listening, yes, we're talking about language, but I also want to think about this in a holistic sense for learning. When you're thinking about learning something, if you want to get more familiar with something, there's a big power in this grazing idea, in this interweaving. Is that what it was called?
Interleaving, like you leave, yeah.
Leaving. I love this idea because it basically says that you're going to dedicate yourself to learning or experiencing something and you want to make it surround sound. That's what I would call it. It's like surround sound learning. It's like you should be listening to that music, doing a cooking class, learning it on your computer, learning it on your iPad, learning it on your podcast, when you're cooking dishes. I think that all of those things can create an experience where it's actually changing your brain because you're putting in so many inputs. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And don't forget that learning means changing your brain. If you're learning something, you're creating new neural connections in the brain, you're changing your brain. Now, deliberate learning, sitting down, I'm going to learn this, is very inefficient. And the more time you spend trying to deliberately learn something, the less efficient it becomes. Whereas the brain likes new things, novelty. It's true. I mean, this is not, the brain likes repetition to some extent, but it likes novelty as well. So you have to give it a balance. So, and of course, the other thing, of course, in language learning is the key is motivation. So I was like you with French at school. We had French. I passed the exam. I was a good student at school. I got good marks, but I couldn't speak. Once I got motivated to learn the language and I started watching movies back in the, in the 60s and stuff, all of a sudden it comes alive. So you're motivated, you spend more time with it, you explore more things in the language, you're not fighting it. And don't, our brains are not very good at theoretical explanations. So anytime it focuses on explaining to you what happens in the language, that's very difficult for us to absorb. Far better that you start to experience it yourself, right? And, I always use the example in English, okay? We know that the third person singular of the present tense in English takes an S, right? I go, you go, he or she goes. So that's the only ending that takes an S. I'm sure that every foreign, non-native speaker of English who learns that very early. And yet that is a very common mistake. They never get rid of that error because it takes much, much longer to develop these habits. And so the explanation doesn't do it. But in school, and that was the case with your French, they try and teach you a bunch of rules. It's terrible. The way they teach language at school is And unfortunately, it's pressure from the students, pressure from the parents, pressure from the school board, all this other stuff that makes them do it.
I want to thank you so much for being on with us. I hope that people listening, I hope that this sparked some interest in learning something new, maybe a language, hopefully a language, but even tackling or experiencing something to expand your brain. And as Steve said,
Right.
learning literally changes your brain. Steve, thank you so much for
It
joining.
does. It does. Not at all. Okay. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you later. Hey, I want to tell you one more thing. You are amazing. The question is, do you know how to share it? I'd love to help. I save my very best tips for my insider subscribers. Subscribe for free at scienceofpeople.com. I know your inbox is sacred, so I promise to send you only emails you will love. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and tap the bell to know when my next video is coming out.